The right to protest is important, Mr. Chairman. I have engaged in it with fellow citizens, peacefully assembling to talk about important public policy issues. My guess is everyone on this committee, probably everyone in the United States Congress, has done the same thing. But I think all the First Amendment is important. Democrats seem to think it's just the right to protest. I think all of them. You think about the freedoms we have in the First Amendment: freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom to assembly, freedom to petition your government, freedom of speech. All of them are important. And what's interesting to me is the very first one the founders mentioned was your right to practice your faith. But government's putting all kinds of limits on Americans' ability to do that, and Democrats are just fine with it. In fact, Democrat mayors and governors have been sued over limiting people's right to freedom of religion. I want consistency. That's what I want. In fact, I'm concerned about the whole Constitution. Democrat mayors and governors have limited Americans' right to exercise their Second Amendment liberties, closing down stores that allow people to exercise and purchase firearms and exercise their Second Amendment liberties. I think it's important that Americans get an education, but we got Democrats who say can't go back to school. Kids can't go get what they need to put them on the path to achieving the American dream. But boy, they can protest. Everyone can protest. In Portland, in fact, the teachers union says we don't want to go back to school. We don't want to teach kids. But they've actually encouraged teachers to go protest. The 9-week protest going on in Portland, where they burn the city every single night, where just last weekend 3 officers were blinded by the lasers that some of these peaceful protesters use. So I'm concerned about Americans, all rights, all the privileges. All kinds of Americans right now aren't permitted to go to work. Maybe it's a small business they started, put their entire life savings on the line, started this business, have a number of employees whose families are counting on them running their business. And what's government do? What do Democrat-led governments do? They arrest them if they want to run their business. Just ask Ian Smith and Frank Trombetta, who run a gym in New Jersey. So the ability to engage in your livelihood, the ability to have your kids get an education, the ability to practice your faith are just as important in my mind as protesting. I just wish the Democrats would look at all the rights we enjoy as Americans and make sure that they're dealt with in a consistent fashion. This idea that we're limiting what people can do, practice their faith, run their business, employ people, engage in their livelihood after they've poured their entire lives, their families' resources into it, is just wrong. You know who else has to go to work? You know what? You know who else has to go to work? Law enforcement has to go to work. Are you guys tracking what's happening to law enforcement at all at these protests? And I'm not talking about the 49 police officers who were attacked 2 weeks ago in Chicago. I'm not talking about the 3 who were blinded this past weekend in Portland. I'm not even talking about what the Seattle chief of police said when she said she can't deploy. She had to do an adjusted deployment for her police officers because the protests are so bad, and the defunding concept that is happening around our country in these in these cities. Chief Best said she had to do an adjusted deployment, told the citizens, we're not going to be there, you're on your own. But where they are out there, these police officers, are you guys tracking what's happening to them? Not talking about the violence, but the exposure they have to the coronavirus? Dr. Fauci?
I'm sorry, sir. What was the question?
Are you tracking what's happening to police officers and their exposure to the coronavirus while they're out doing their job?
I don't do tracking of the infection. That's probably more of a CDC question. I've not tracked. Is
that a concern? You talk about park police who've been under siege. You're talking about law enforcement in our municipalities that have been attacked. But I'm just talking about the exposure to the virus as well when people are yelling and screaming in their face. Are you concerned about that?
As I said before, I'm concerned about any crowds, particularly people who don't wear masks. I'm concerned more about indoor crowds than I am at outdoor crowds, but crowds without masks are a problem.
Dr. Redfield?
We continue to look at a variety of number of first responders in some of our surveys, looking at antibody to try to understand what the virus attack rate is. We do have that for some cities. I don't have it for the West Coast right now. But
so you do have that information on some law enforcement in some cities?
First responders, for example, we've done New York, we've done Detroit, we're doing Rhode Island right now, and
Well, that'd be information that'd be information that'd be helpful to this committee when I think about what our law enforcement is having to endure, particularly at these protests. Not just the violence, but the exposure now that they're getting to the virus from the protesters. And frankly, I wish we would get something from the other side. The silence on what's happening at these protests and the impact it's having on our law enforcement, I think, is just unfortunate. I hope they join us in speaking out against the defund the police concept and everything that's happening to law enforcement around the country.